So productivity is at the core of everything that the UK is trying to do at the moment. Whether, again, you're thinking about this at the level of, let's say, the Midlands, or whether you're thinking about this at the level of the UK, if we don't do something about the lagging levels of productivity that the UK has had since the onset of the financial crisis, which, let's face it, is very nearly 20, it's nearer 20 years than 10 years now. If we don't do something about that, we are just going to keep getting poorer and poorer. So the purpose of this then is to explore, particularly with a focus around the firm, how we can do things to start addressing that problem. Anyone who tells you the productivity malaise in the UK is caused by just one thing, just ignore what they say, because it's clearly multifaceted. There is clearly lots of things to this. We can talk about institutions and policy and Brexit and lots of other things. But the fact is, if we don't come up with firm level responses and help firms think about how they might address this, we're not going to get any further. Somebody's talking over me.
Yeah, I'm trying to mute.
So if we don't help firms come up with that sort of thing, then we're all kind of wasting our time. That is not to say academics pontificate and firms should just do what we say. The very much the ethos of our regional productivity forums is that this is a two-way dialogue. This is not academics just saying, this is what we found, sit and listen. This needs to be a two-way dialogue between, this is what the evidence is telling us, but how do we translate that into sort of understanding for firms? If anybody at the end of this, if you are running businesses and you have an interest in how we might help thinking about such things, we have a kind of two-page, I'm not quite sure what you'd call it, a two-page kind of introduction to how you might benchmark productivity against competitors that some firms, possibly people on this call, have used before. I'm not going to plug that anymore now, but if anything resonates, then by all means get in touch with me, Jan, Armin, and we can absolutely have that conversation. And with that, I am going to shut up and let the important people who've actually got things to say speak. So just finally, thank you very much again for people giving their time to come today.
Thank you, Nigel. This is really good. Before continue on, I just want to mention that and I shared the link to Inside Report. This is updated Inside Report for Midlands that we produced. And we actually cover a number of productivity challenges. And we identified that one of the top productivity challenges is linked to skill gap shortages. So therefore, I'm very happy that we have a number of external speakers. I'm very happy that we have Jamie Carter from the Make UK as a policy manager, head of employment and skill policy manager at Make UK. He actually extensively working on this topic and as actually collaborating a lot with and then talking to at the parliament about these issues, so making a direct impact on the policy improvements. So without actually overdue, let me just check if Jamie's here and then pass the stage to him.
Yeah, I'm here, Armin.
Yeah, I'm trying to identify you, make you a presenter. 1 second. Okay. So, Jamie, stage is yours.
Great, thank you. Am I able to share my slides, or are you going to share them?
I have all the slides. I can flip them through. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Simon, and morning, everyone. I'm Jamie Cater from Make UK. For those who aren't familiar with Make UK, we are the representative body for engineering and manufacturing employers in the UK. So we represent a total of around 22,000 engineering and manufacturing businesses across all regions of the UK, all shapes and sizes, manufacturing subsectors. And as you would imagine, the skills gap, technical skills gap in manufacturing is a really significant challenge for our members. So, Armin, if we could move on to the first slide. I just thought I'd start by giving a bit of an overview of how things look in manufacturing at the moment in terms of supply and demand of skills. We have a sort of historically high level of live vacancies in manufacturing. That picture is starting to change slightly as recruitment improves, but there is still a relatively high proportion of skill shortage vacancies. So more than a third of vacancies in manufacturing are in skill shortage areas. Anyone who's seen the most recent report from Skills England, published towards the end of last year, will see that in sort of occupations like electrical engineering, those are particularly prominent examples of skill shortage vacancies where supply is falling, but demand for those occupations is increasing and forecast to increase even further. So the chart on the right of the screen is taken from a member survey we did towards the end of last year around barriers to recruitment, and you can see very clearly the extent to which a lack of the right technical skills is considered by manufacturers to be the primary barrier to successful recruitment. So around 3/4 of manufacturers finding that they cannot recruit candidates with the right technical skills for the job they're hiring for. And as I say, that there is a particular issue around the occupations where there is forecast to be kind of strongest growth in demand. So some of those sort of higher level technical skills, we see, I think, particular pressure at the moment around the kind of intermediate level stuff. So I'm thinking about occupations like welders, tool makers, those sorts of kind of technician type roles at sort of around level 3 in the education system. We're seeing a bit of a shift in demand because of digitalization, sustainability, the way in which kind of industry is changing, those skills demands are changing, and a bit of a shift towards the more kind of professional graduate level engineering roles. So that's where we see demand really increasing, but there are already notable shortages in those sorts of areas. So some of those kind of professional engineering roles, civil engineers, mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, often until kind of recent changes to the immigration system, they would have been on the shortage occupation list. So we know there are already shortages of skilled labour there. And we think there is insufficient training available, and so the number of people able to do those jobs is falling as demand for those roles is increasing. I think importantly for what we're going to come on to in terms of upskilling and retraining is the ageing workforce. which is not unique to manufacturing. It's reflected in other sectors like construction. Very similar issue, where there is a big challenge around replacing those skills or keeping those workers productive for longer. And what I think we're seeing at the moment is manufacturers doing everything they can to kind of eke as much out of those older workers as possible, while it remains challenging to kind of bring in younger people into the sector, to upskill and retrain some of those younger existing workers to be more productive, to take on those roles. So Armin, if we could move on to the next slide.
Sure.
There is a kind of a broad narrative, I think, around declining UK employer investment in skills. There is, I think, another parts of that equation which we'll come on to, which is declining public investment in skills training as well. It's not just the private sector and private sector employers who are investing less. It is the UK government that is investing less in support for skills training as well. But we do see that it is a priority for manufacturers. A majority of manufacturing businesses are increasing or at least holding steady their investment in skills. Being able to prioritize that training is a challenge given the increasing cost of doing business, particularly the rising costs associated with employing people. We all know that's going to increase again from April. So it is a challenge to kind of to continue to protect those internal budgets for skills training, but it is a priority for manufacturers. And you can see from the chart on the right there the extent to which the investment in upskilling and retraining existing staff is becoming more of a priority. So really interesting how on one hand we kind of have this aging workforce, which is kind of prompting people to think about how we get younger people into the sector, those people coming into the labour market for the first time. How do we make sure they have the right kind of skills, knowledge and behaviours to come into the workplace and to be productive? But equally those sort of people, not just the older workers who might be 10, 15 years away from retirement, but younger workers than that, and how the kind of rapid changes associated with bringing in new industrial digital technologies, the changes that are being made to sort of reduce the environmental impact in a sector like manufacturing, means that those existing jobs are changing very quickly, and the skills required to do them are changing. And so that increasing demand, not just to have the right skills training for young people coming into employment for the first time, but those people whose jobs will change quite significantly over the course of their careers. I think it's important, though, when we're sort of thinking about employer investment in the kind of the resilience of their workforce, to think not just about kind of skills and training, but something we're particularly seeing in manufacturing is that growing investment in health and well-being. Again, particularly important in the context of an aging workforce and people in manufacturing who might have been doing sort of work that is particularly kind of physically intensive, people who kind of pick up long-term health conditions over the course of time working in manufacturing. There is, again, kind of two sides to this. There is an expectation from parts of the younger workforce that is part of the offer that an employer has to an employee as part of their work support for kind of physical and mental health and general well-being, but also this kind of slightly more reactive thing that is sort of based around interventions for those mostly older people with long-term health conditions to help them stay in the workforce and be more productive for longer. So reducing long-term sickness absence, reducing presenteeism from people who, maybe require a period of short-term absence but are still turning up to work and being less productive in work because they're not well. So we see that alongside investment in skills training as being a really important part of what manufacturers are doing to address some of their productivity challenges. Next slide, Arman.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll wrap up on this one, but just to give you a bit of a sense of where we see the need for employers in our sector for more training around sort of productivity challenges. So we need a more consistent approach to training for people who are already in the labour market. I think part of this session was kind of partly framed around an intervention from a previous government called the National Retraining Scheme, which never fully got off the ground. It was sort of fragmented by the Johnson government into a couple of different programmes. But it kind of fundamentally that recognised this sort of growing demand and growing need for shorter, modular, more flexible skills training options for people who were already in work to make sure that their kind of skills and capabilities were keeping up with changing demands in industry. This government has now committed to continuing with a policy from the previous government, the lifelong learning entitlement, where people of working age can access the sort of equivalent in value in loan funding to an undergraduate tuition fee loan for upskilling and retraining over the course of their career. That will take effect from 2027. We think that's prioritising the right areas. So it's looking at levels 4 to 6. So it's reflecting that kind of changing demand in industry, that shift towards higher level technical skills. But what it doesn't have at the moment is a clear pathway between levels. So particularly for those who are in occupations where they might have level 3 apprenticeship, they might need to be upskilled and retrained to a slightly higher level in the future. It's not clear how those things kind of join up with each other at the moment. So what we have, I think, in the UK at the moment, or sorry, in England at the moment, is a kind of patchwork quilt, really, of upskilling and retraining options for employees and employers, neither necessarily fully understanding what the options are and how they can be beneficial. So we need a more joined up approach. Part of that is addressing, I think, what are very familiar issues with the apprenticeship levy. We think the government is right to be reforming this. And what we would like to see as part of that is more of a focus on upskilling and retraining of people already in work. So taking the model of apprenticeship training and making it more flexible, more accessible for people who are already in work and might not need a full apprenticeship to get the technical skills that they need. And so when we're thinking about that policy reform, when we're thinking about where government prioritises funding, we want those clear pathways all the way through the system so that there are clear pathways, clear opportunities for progression.
Jamie, I'm sorry. We need to move on to the next speaker.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, sorry for cutting off. We actually a bit time constrained, but toward the end we have Q&A, and during that time we can have more discussion and come back to Jamie. Jamie, this is excellent work. This is a very important issue at the moment, what we're having, given that currently the minimum wage is increasing, national insurance is increasing, all this pressure is going on the businesses, and for them to find the funds to retrain the existing staff is quite difficult. We're going to come back to that. We have Matthew Rhodes. Matthew Rhodes is Previously, he was the project lead for the Black Country Industrial Cluster, and he's currently a director of the Cameras. We had very nice conversation. I think this is quite relevant, given that in Midlands we concentrate on the energy intensive production, manufacturing production, and this uses a lot of energy. And we find out that the energy cost is quite high in the UK, in Midlands, compared to other countries. And we're also having a lot of other kind of difficulties with developing industrial clusters, and the clusters are quite important for economic drive. We see clear correlation between the counties that have industrial clusters and the high productivity levels, and we have other counties which don't have, and with a low productivity level. So let me give a stage to Matthew to talk about his project and what he thinks is we should be doing in that spectrum. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Arman, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along this morning. Are you going to do the slides, Arman?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I had to go back.
Okay. So as Arman said, yes, I'm a director of Cameras, which facilitates collaborative projects around the country. I'm also a director of the Black Country Industrial Cluster, which I'll come on to in a second. So as Arman said, we had an innovation project which ended nearly 2 years ago now, but the industrial partners in that project asked the project team to continue and have set up a non-profit company called the Black Country Industrial Cluster. So just as a point of clarification, we are actually continuing, and I'm part of that initiative as well. If we go on to the next slide, Arman, yeah. So the background to all this, just very briefly in terms of industrial clusters and what we mean in this context. Because this is now a much abused word, really. I think in not just in the UK but around the world. So we're a place-based cluster collaboration. We were set up in 2019. It was actually part of a programme that was Theresa May's government's idea. And that was, we have a problem in the UK with some big, heavy traditional industrial clusters, and decarbonising those to achieve the target of a zero carbon UK by 2050 is going to be challenging, particularly if they're petrochemicals or steelworks where they need carbon, and cements and other sector, which they can't be just simply electrified. They're going to generate carbon from their process. They need hydrogen or they need gas of some form. So major problem. They put about £500 million aside. The Black Country, and as a partnership with including universities of Loughborough and Warwick and Birmingham, was the only one of the clusters in that programme, and there are only 6 or 7, which was not a coastal cluster, which did not involve petrochemicals or steel, and was in a slightly different problem, as I'll come on to, and that begins to make the link to productivity. The Johnson government extended this programme, I think partly as a result of becoming aware that this problem was bigger than about 50 or 60 very large petrochemical or steel plants, and did in fact cover the rest of the economy as well. They extended the programme and funded about 13 or 14 local industrial clusters across the country for 24, the calendar year 24. Some of those projects are still ongoing because they were slightly delayed starting points. But so there's now local industrial clusters, place-based clusters within this programme around the country. The Black Country was not allowed to bid, which I took as a compliment, really. But we were asked to support other clusters. So we've been working with Northern Ireland, with the West of England, which is Bristol, and with the Yorkshire clusters as they're putting their plans together at the moment. So we've been heavily involved in all parts of this really over the last 5 years now. And productivity has become an explicit focus from the last year as those smaller clusters got more involved. It's much more relevant to decarbonisation, industrial decarbonisation, when you've got large numbers of small manufacturing firms, so productivity, than it is if you think the solution is simply a new hydrogen plant or changing your fuel or maybe carbon capture, which is where the big guys tend to think. So that's one big infrastructure project. Okay, next slide. The next slide, Armin, if we can.
Yeah.
Sorry. So how are decarbonisation and productivity linked? I thought it was kind of helpful for me and given the topic of the seminar, try and be explicit about how these two things come together. I think there are a number of reasons or interesting links that it's worth thinking about. One of the really unanticipated outcomes of all the work we've done with industrial clusters through this program is decarbonisation is a really helpful convening force. So it brings companies together where they might not come together otherwise, because this is a really challenging issue, particularly for businesses, as I think Armin said a few minutes ago, in places like the Midlands where they're very energy intense. So decarbonisation can threaten your business. UK and Irish, actually, energy prices are among the highest in the developed industrial world. So we're talking about the highest in Europe and four to five times pre-Donald Trump US electricity prices, for example. So if you base your company in those other countries, you're going to immediately be more productive. So it's a challenging context, and this topic is one where people don't have the expertise to deal with it on their own, particularly in smaller businesses. So they come together to try and tackle that very important issue to them. The obvious starting points for decarbonisation in this industrial demographic as well are common with productivity. So we're talking about resource energy efficiency improvements, basically running your company more efficiently, saving money, circular economy, and understanding what actually goes on through metering, etc., inside your business, which also helps you drive productivity. And I'll come on to that. Some of the work we'll be doing in Northern Ireland on the next slide in a second. Both productivity and decarbonisation merit from place-based industry-led approaches, which is what these industrial clusters do. Decarbonisation solutions, once you go beyond energy efficiency and good housekeeping, you're probably talking about on-site generation, making the most of your available local energy resources, circular economy type solutions. They're all local. It's helpful to know your local peers in the industrial world. And as the previous speaker touched on, the productivity isn't, and Nigel mentioned earlier as well, this isn't ever one answer. You need to integrate across multiple things. And again, localities are easier places often to integrate things than at national level. There's a particular gap in England that I've become very aware of since working in Northern Ireland, where everything is beautifully integrated and you've got the political boundaries match energy boundaries, match industrial boundaries, and you've got entities like Invest Northern Ireland or similar ones in Scotland and Wales that pull everything together. That's much harder in England, where we have a much more complicated sort of political context.
Sorry, Matthew, 1 more minute.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. I only got 2 more slides. Very quick. Okay. This is what we actually did in the Black Country. So it's a different methodology when you've got a large number of small firms from a small number of very large firms. We did master plans for relocating businesses in hubs, and we redesigned how we do energy efficiency support for firms, and that's going forward. We had an industrial advisory board, which I've already touched on. Go on to the next slide then, Armin, because I actually had one more slide than I thought. In Northern Ireland, we've linked this directly with productivity. So having got about 1,200 companies engaged with our project in the Midlands or the West Midlands, we've managed to engage about 200-300 companies in Northern Ireland who are all providing data into our energy and emissions tools, and we've added productivity to that so that they're beginning to get immediate feedback on productivity. That's the convening force I was talking about. So we've got online tools to do this. If you go on to the next slide, final slide. So overall lessons, insights. This is really quite hard work. You have to build the trust of these companies. You have to offer them specific expertise. I think we offered them practical engineering expertise, both at a kind of micro level, so how to run your manufacturing lines better, and people understood that, and also at the macro level of kind of major investments in new energy plants or whatever. And academic expertise and political expertise. We had to be quite patient in terms of bringing companies on board. We had trust because of the some of the partners. We always work with established relationships and networks. These things have to be industry-led. I think that's an obvious statement. We can come back in the discussion if people want to talk a bit more about that. And this does resonate globally. So this was a topic at the World Economic Forum last week and last year as well. And people publish reports on this sort of thing. But it's not just about infrastructure solutions. It's about productivity improvement and very practical, detailed engineering solutions within companies and across companies as well. Thanks very much, Armin.
Thank you, Matthew. I apologize, we're slightly off in terms of timing from the initial schedule. So let me just move on. We have Janet Godsell, who's a co-lead as well of the Midlands Productivity Forum. She's a professor of operations supply chain strategy, and she will be talking about supply chain productivity. Jan?
Yeah. Armin, could you just give me control and then I can just move my own slides?
Sure.
So good morning, everybody. Actually, it's very nice to see Matthew, because probably one of the projects that I've been proudest to be part of was Repowering the Black Country. I think actually, if we think about where the world is heading and the need to perhaps rethink growth, I think we can have, I perhaps agree with someone like Daniel Susskind that we can grow, but we perhaps need to think about a different type of growth that perhaps is more balanced and also better looks at the societal and the environmental impacts. Repowering the Black Country was an amazing project, because if you think the Black Country originally got its wealth from stuff that came out the ground, coal, and then in essence, as it no longer did that, it perhaps went into slight economic decline and had productivity issues. And there is an opportunity to think of new energy sources, but also the different ways of configuring their value chain locally and nationally to actually think about how that region could become an industrial powerhouse again. And it was a really fantastic project to be part of, and all credit to the likes of Matthew, who had the foresight to think of us being able to take that type of approach. So I should be able to forward my own slides.
Yep.
Oops. It's misbehaving. Armin, maybe it's better you do it. I think you are doing it, which is the next slide, please. So there's, oh, could you just go back? Thank you. So there's three things I'm going to very quickly cover. And I'm also very, very grateful to work with Nigel. He's international business and an economist with a slightly more open mind too, because actually both Matthew and Nigel had open enough minds to consider the role that a supply chain might play in this productivity or repowering debate. And that linked us onto this idea of supply chain productivity. And then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about an initiative to try and bring people together called UK Scale. Next slide, please. So if we think about supply chains and their management, next slide, please, Armin. One of the things that we discover is that people look at supply chains in very, very different ways. So when some people talk about supply chain, they're perhaps talking about the network in which different firms join together. Sometimes the word ecosystem is increasingly used, particularly perhaps in a circular economy sense, or something like Repowering the Black Country, where you've got output or waste of one company being used as an input to another. Others will look at flow. So people very familiar with lean would perhaps talk about flow. And actually flow is both of information, cash and materials. And increasingly, we might also look at carbon as a flow. And actually carbon and thinking about carbon flow and how we manage that could help to actually create better supply chain collaboration. But what many people don't know is there's actually an industry standard for supply chains. It was developed by the Supply Chain Council, now known by APEX, which essentially defines supply chains as the coming together of 5 core processes: planning, procurement, manufacturing, logistics, and reverse logistics, or those return processes. And together they form the supply chain operations reference model. And essentially, when we look at supply chains, they suggest that you look at it from your customer's customer to your supplier's supplier. Next slide, please. But actually, when we talk to organisations, in the Midlands is very dominated by automotive and aerospace. And actually, automotive and aerospace organisations have traditionally had quite a limited view of what the supply chain is. So quite often those organisations are quite procurement dominant. And when they talk about supply chain, what they're really talking about is supply-based management, how they manage their suppliers. And sometimes, because of the nature of those industries being very cost-driven, that can be quite adversarial, where they're looking for year-on-year cost downs without necessarily having the associated productivity gains to support them. There's then some sort of intermediate states where you might be looking at the resource flow between the manufacturer and the supplier, sort of materials management, and sometimes the procurement and materials management comes together. But the supply chain operations reference approach, or the approach that I would take as a supply chain professional, is to look at this end to end, because essentially our supply chains are demand driven. They respond to an end customer demand. And in essence, what we're trying to do, if we want to be more productive, is to coordinate that flow of products, cash and materials across the end-to-end supply chain. Next slide, please. And this leads us on to how we could improve supply chain productivity. Next slide, please. And so I was very fortunate, as I said, to work with previous slide, please, Armin, to work with Nigel and others. And this came about from a discussion with Bays where and that was when Bays existed. But basically, civil servants, 80% of civil servants are economists. So therefore, if you want to try to influence them or change their mind, you need to be able to talk the language of an economist, which unfortunately I am not, nor do particularly effectively. And in essence, whilst this concept that actually, if you think about it, what we currently have is probably a range of different firms that form a network. Within them, planning isn't necessarily a strength. We haven't tended to favour that process. We've tended to favour procurement. And what we tend to get is very siloed decision making, both within our firms and between our firms, which means essentially with uncontrolled buffers. We have demand getting sort of thrown over fences in a lumpy and slightly unpredictable way, which leads to not just individual firms potentially being unproductive, but the end-to-end supply chain being unproductive. But in essence, no matter which supply chain I've looked at over the years, there's always a degree of underlying steady demand. And if we were to take more of a planning orientation, planning is the glue that holds the supply chain together, and could coordinate across those different entities, we could actually make not only the individual firms, but the end-to-end supply chain and our entire region more productive. Next slide, please. And ultimately, this doesn't require anything particularly fancy. I was in Davos last week and I was a bit shocked. Everything's solved by AI, but the reality is all of AI starts with data, then it starts with probably simple optimization or analytics, then it probably goes to what we'd see as some predictive analytics. And then if you're going to use which a lot perhaps uses machine learning, and when you get onto the really fancy stuff that's perhaps using more generative AI, those applications we actually need that are very, very small. Most supply chains could be improved hugely just by the very basics of better balance in demand and supply, which could be done by good management practice and the prudent use of an ERP system. Because essentially we need to understand our customer demand pattern, use the principles of the lean philosophy, which says understand customer value, so the demand, develop value streams, which means there's likely to be more than one of them because you're likely to have different demand patterns, to make it flow at the pull of the customer in pursuit of perfection. And what this means is we just need to adopt a really good supply chain planning mentality, identify those different flow types, which of geographical segmentation, and then connect those dots end to end. Next slide, please.
And 1 minute.
Okay, I'm going to have to be very quick then, Arman. Because actually to do this, we need to understand our buffers, and they could be spare production capacity, inventory or time. And if demand is stable, then actually those buffers can be very small. But if demand is truly unpredictable and you want to meet customer demand, those buffers might need to be bigger. Next slide, please, Armen. And I have yet to look at a supply chain where I haven't found 60 to 70% stable demand. And there's very simple, we don't need AI, there's very simple analysis that we can do to help understand those demand patterns. Next slide, please, Arman. And OEMs actually have a really, really important part to play in this, because they're the head of the fish and a dead fish rots from the head. So if an OEM at the head of a supply, if the OEMs in our region can really understand that they play a role in coordinating the entire supply chain, we can actually start to make our entire end-to-end supply chains more productive. Similarly, we have a lot of SMEs in our region that probably aren't prioritising planning. If we as a region could create a planning hub, so those SMEs could use planning as a service, that would really, really help them to improve too. And I won't talk about UK scale, Arman, because I don't have time. I'll just stop there.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, as a moderator, I think I'm doing a poor job with managing this. The timing part. So this next part is oops, just switch. Yeah. So like I said, my name is Arman Margev. I'm a senior research associate. I'll try to do my best with key takeaways from these sessions, and also talk about what kind of actions we should be doing as a next step. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much to Jamie, Matthew, and John to talk about these important issues. Probably they require more time to discuss all the details, but at least I think that one of the key messages that we've got from the Jamie's talk is that we have increasing demand for upskilling and retraining existing workers, and some of the part of it is along it goes with a skill part is the demographic situation. We have aging population, which means that aging workers, so which means that we are not having enough young workforce. Possibly this has to do with the trends such as like young people choosing degrees which are not related to technical fields, not related. Possibly these young people having difficulty in entering locally, finding jobs once they graduate. Possibly this has to do also with London and other places being more attractive as a workplace and so on. This is also has to do with the incentive being provided, and also probably some of the surveys is indicating that firms in Midlands are not doing enough investment on a training part. And we also discussed with Jamie as well about apprenticeship schemes. So apprenticeship seems to be should be one of the solutions. While you're working, you continue actually educating yourself, training yourself, having access to some training programs, and then this way you can actually build your skills and keep up with the technological development, so on. So that seems to be one of the difficulties, where apprenticeship levy being collected but not fully effectively allocate, or there is some kind of bureaucratic limitations to have access to it. So there is definitely, we provide in the report some of the kind of evidences suggesting that as the skill gap increases in a particular sector, based on the employer skill survey, the firms are reporting it, then we see the productivity in exactly same kind of firms, same sectors are actually dropping. And this seems to be, there is a clear trend, and therefore it's very important that the firms understand how important that the upskilling the existing work, training them, continuously training them is so important. Matthew, we talked about industrial clusters and your successful, I think it is a very successful example, the Black Country cluster. I think it's this such a project has to have applications on other parts of the Midlands as well. It was very interesting also to learn that by actually designing the industrial clusters properly in one place and allowing the firms to exchange the heat and cooling, they could actually reduce the energy spending and make it more efficient. And that actually contributes a lot on the competitiveness. So it reduces the cost on the energy side. And if you are an energy intensive producer, then therefore it can give you some competitive edge at the end of the day. Yeah, so customers pay attention on the cost of the products, whether it is locally made product, whether it is coming internationally. And so Midlands is actually producers are competing against other regions as well. So yeah, so the main lessons that I think from this Black Country example is that it requires more kind of holistic, long-term vision. It requires thinking about supply chain, and this is interlinked of strategy, infrastructure planning, and cutting all kind of bureaucracies and planning permission and so on, and providing more incentive for firms to move to relocate themselves to such kind of places. John, we talked about supply chain problems in Midlands. There seems to be some cases where we could the people have a misunderstanding in terms of the cost of getting some kind of material component input made locally as opposed to getting it from Asia and somewhere. So they straight away look at the cost of the components, and then they don't consider the cost of transport and logistics and other kind of add-ons that goes on top. And it may be the case that something actually considering inputs made locally is quite important. I understand what you said about networks and process and flows and so on. The way I look at this is there is a separate stages interconnected from extraction, input production, final product production, distribution, and bringing it to customers, and then bring it back probably as a part of the circular economy back to the production field as an input. So from that aspect, what I find is that very striking picture is that in Midlands, we do quite well in terms of developing the circular economy models and recycling things. And we have very high kind of waste management. We have very high participation, local participation. But when it comes to final goods production, when it comes to inputs that locally made, it's tend to actually allow international firms to provide more input, and this is probably where it becomes very, very important for the resilience, for the stability of the supply chain and the entire economy, local economy. It will be very important to have this more kind of inclusive kind of growth, with allowing local domestic suppliers to participate more in this supply chain system. If you remember, this was an energy crisis we had. Energy price went up, and then it's actually shaked the entire sector. So I think that's very important. But also, yeah, you haven't due to time, you haven't mentioned about the scale center. This now in Loughborough Business School, we have a scale center, which actually provides training program on this aspect of this supply chain and understanding of the how to actually effectively, efficiently actually form these supply chains. And it would be very important for us to form some kind of planning hubs as well, So I think this is to my view, is the key takeaway points. What things I think we should do as well. So I don't need to too much convince you on the importance of this productivity for the economic growth. There's definitely a relationship between once your productivity goes up and so the living standards goes up and the wages are higher. Of course, we have a number of productivity challenges. Many of them has been known for many years, which suggests that either our approach is not that precise if we're still actually facing the same productivity challenges. I think we need to be more proactive. We need to be more proactive locally. That's why for this call, as much as possible, I invited local kind of policymakers. I invited business representatives. I invited engineers from other universities, academics, and so on. So this is only the way, by being proactive, by trying to deal with that. And to be honest, what I during this search, what I understood is that we have a lot of initiative. We have a lot of projects which actually managed locally, managed through collaboration of regional stakeholders to solve them. I think that this is because we are a bit fragmented and separated from each other. Yeah, we have East Midlands, West Midlands, we have different counties. It seems to be we need to interact a bit more, collaborate, share information, share best practices, and so on, adopt this. We also need to look at the international best practices. You know, skill gap problem exists in other places as well around the world. So it's a burning issue in other parts of the UK as well. So I think this is important. I also think we need to develop lifelong kind of learning culture. And like I said, we need to develop more kind of employee education kind of partnership. What I think is one of the surveys that I noticed is that employers are saying that the graduates, you take the graduates, you realize that they don't possess the necessary skills, the necessary knowledge. It might actually indicate also that is the training program is actually delivering the right skills. And so maybe we need to improve our communication so that educators build the programs based on what the local business need. And a lot of times this young people, when they study, they would actually like to stay locally. They would like to find opportunity in Midlands, and we need to actually ensure this is happening. Yeah, we also need to do data sharing. So we need to make informed decisions. A lot of time I find that it's very difficult to access existing data. It exists somewhere, but you cannot access it, and therefore you cannot have better understanding. So I'm conscious of the time. It's 56. So I should cut it over here. And one of the things that we would like to do, we would like to, as a next step, as a Midlands RPF, we would like to focus on collaborative kind of activities that would lead to actions. And so if possible, after this call, I will be sending email with a link to the feedback form. If possible, participants, if you could actually make your suggestions on how we should be, what kind of way we should collaborate with you, what ideas you have, what suggestions you have for the future kind of events that we can concentrate. I think I should stop and give the stage to my colleague, Tom.
Thank you, Arman. So that leaves us with a few minutes for questions. I think in the chat, there were two questions. Yeah. One, probably for Jamie, about why firms do not invest more in educating their workforce if that is such a big problem. Jamie, I saw you typed something into the chat, but maybe you want to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thanks for those questions in the chat. I'll do my best to be as concise as possible. I think, you know, there are lots of reasons why I think employers in our sector struggle to invest as much in skills training as ideally they would like to. The biggest barrier that we're aware of is that employers feel that they can't access the right training provision locally. That comes up as a barrier for 47% of manufacturers. What we've seen, particularly in relation to apprenticeship training, is because of the funding model for that, we're seeing FE colleges, training providers withdrawing engineering and manufacturing apprenticeship training provision because they are funded to provide it at a rate that is significantly below the true cost of delivering it, and so it's become not viable for them to continue to offer it. And so manufacturers who want to invest in that training find that they can't, because they can't access the provision in the right place, the right provision in the right place. In terms, I think particularly if we're thinking about the existing workforce, there is a challenge in the situation where firms have existing labour shortages. They already don't have enough skilled workers. They struggle to reconcile the kind of the short-term loss in capacity for putting an existing worker on a training program with the sort of that long-term return on investment. And so I think we find that people are reluctant to kind of take that short-term cost in terms of what it costs to give them the training, that kind of loss of kind of productive capacity in the short term, in order to kind of generate that longer term kind of return in kind of higher skills, higher productivity. So that's a real challenge, I think.
Yes.
The final thing I would say is just that there is also a question here. We talked about employment costs. I think the impact of really big minimum wage increases has an interesting impact here as well when it comes to existing workers, where one of the big impacts we see of those minimum wage increases is a real kind of compression in pay scales. And so one of the effects that we're kind of seeing that having is potentially a reduced appetite for employees to engage in workplace training, because they no longer associate it with delivering a kind of a pay increase effectively.
Yes.
So if they take the time out of their work to do that training, and the expectation that it might lead to a pay rise, a promotion, because of the impact of the minimum wage on kind of pay scales and job roles, that doesn't necessarily happen anymore. So there's less of an appetite for the worker to engage with it, and the employer maybe feels like there's not so much benefit in offering it because they don't feel they can offer someone that promotion or that step up in the same way, because those pay scales have become so compressed. Those mid-level job roles might have been taken out because of that pay scale compression. So those are some very quick thoughts on why I think there's less employer investment in upskilling and retraining than we might want to see, compared with what we know the level of demand for it is.
Thank you, Jamie. Maybe as a quick,
I'm conscious of time. It's 11:01, but yeah. So if any participants here, we would like to do more Q&A. If you can stay a bit longer for 5 minutes more, thanks.
Okay. Maybe on that note, as the last question,
Last one.
there was a question in the chat about the service industries. I mean, manufacturing is a very important part of the economy, but it's not the largest part. So maybe we can do a last quick round about the lessons we might have for services. I guess many of the things we discussed equally apply to services. Maybe Nigel, are you still around? Can you say a word? I'm sure your analogy about the numbers applies to services as well.
Yeah, so I think from a productivity stance, the major difference between services and manufacturing is measurement is a little bit harder, and measurement is more skewed by price effects. So to give you a really trivial example, you measure the productivity, let's say, of a waiter in a hotel or a restaurant in London and the waiter in a curry house in Bradford. The waiter in the restaurant in London is going to look like they're doing more business because, quite simply, they're taking more money on a given day. And that's not because they're speedier at delivering food or speedier at taking orders. It's because the price of what they're serving is more expensive. So and that kind of is more, it's more problematic in services. After that, the problems are really similar, and the diagnosis in terms of skills, in terms of skill shortages, in terms of connectivity, in terms of the links between exporting and productivity, all of that is really similar across services and manufacturing. The major difference is it's kind of harder to measure. We saw, I mean, I'll just give you, if you look at the data for productivity, it falls off a cliff at the point at which we had the financial crisis of 2008. Now, one interpretation of that is an awful lot of the, in quotes, productivity growth that we were seeing in the 2000s was from the financial services sector, where basically what they were doing was selling each other, we now know, selling each other assets at ever inflated prices and recording that as productivity growth. So an awful lot of the previous growth that we'd seen wasn't actually productivity growth. It was kind of looked like traders were becoming more productive because they were making more money. After that, as I say, the issues are very similar. And if anybody wants to pursue that further, they're very welcome to get in touch. Our kind of 2-page prompt for how you might benchmark your productivity works just as well for service sectors as it does for manufacturing sectors.
Thank you, Nigel. I see Matthew has his hand up.
Yeah, I have to make a quick point here from the perspective of industrial decarbonisation and energy, which has been the major convening force in pulling the cluster project together in my experience. The difference between manufacturing and services is to do with the proportion of your energy bills which are related to your unique manufacturing process. So we did this bit of research as part of a project we did following the repowering project. I think it's something like 80% of your energy bills will be to do with your manufacturing process, which will be unique to your company, as in if you're a foundry, it will be to do with what you do, melting metal, etc. If you're a bakery, it's to do with that. If you're a service business, your energy bill will mostly be to do with your building and your computers and so on. And it's actually the same problem across the entire world, or certainly the entire UK. So it's not a local thing. It's not something that pulls your cluster together. It's not something that gets you to focus on productivity. But in the manufacturing sector, it absolutely gets you to focus on the productivity and the way you run your business. So it's a big difference.
Aman,
I think, yeah, we should finalize this.
Up.
There is, we can talk about a lot of important things. I am getting a lot of ideas as well to talk about, but I think we should finalize it. First of all, I would like to thank the participants. Jamie, thank you very much. Matthew, thank you very much. Jan, Nigel, Thomas, thank you very much for your time, for actually contributing and speaking today and sharing your ideas. Thank you very much to participants. I hope you find it useful, and hopefully we're gonna come back with more events, even more useful events, hopefully. Please do check out the Inside Report. We just discussed some of the challenges here, but there is more kind of challenges we have. And yeah, I will be actually sending email after this, asking you to fill out the feedback form and to make some suggestions on what you would like to do next, and what topics you would like to us to cover, concentrate on, or the format of engagement. So thank you all. Thank you, and have a good day.